And this is the summary of the report of the Special Rapporteur on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Summary. The current international situation of drug control has focused on creating a drug-free world almost exclusively through use of law enforcement policies and criminal sanctions. Mounting evidence, however, suggests this approach has failed, primarily because it does not acknowledge the realities of drug use and dependence. Now, the funny thing is here, of course, is the word realities. And if governments don't acknowledge the realities of drug use and dependence, then they are not living in reality, and that in itself is a form of psychosis. But I diversify there, and I should return to the summary. I'll begin again. I may stop again as well. The current international system of drug control has focused on creating a drug-free world, almost exclusively through use of law enforcement policies and criminal sanctions. Mounting evidence, however, suggests this approach has failed, primarily because it does not acknowledge the realities of drug use and dependence. While drugs may have a pernicious effect on individual lives and society, this excessively punitive regime has not achieved its stated public health goals and has resulted in countless human rights violations. People who use drugs may be deterred from accessing services owing to the threat of criminal punishment, or may be denied access to health care altogether. Criminalisation and excessive law enforcement practices also undermine health promotion initiatives, perpetuate stigma and increase health risks to which entire populations, not only those who use drugs, may be exposed. Certain countries incarcerate people who use drugs, impose compulsory treatment upon them, or both. The current international drug control regime also unnecessarily limits access to essential medications, which violates the enjoyment of the right to health. The primary goal of the international drug control regime, as set forth in the preamble of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs 1961, is the health and welfare of mankind. But the current approach to controlling drug use and possession works against that aim. Widespread implementation of interventions that reduce harms associated with drug use, harm reduction initiatives, and of decriminalisation of certain laws governing drug control would improve the health and welfare of people who use drugs and the general population demonstrably. Moreover, the United Nations entities, the member states, should adopt a right to health approach to drug control, encourage system-wide coherence and communication, incorporate the use of indicators and guidelines, and consider developing a new legal framework concerning certain illicit drugs in order to ensure that the rights of people who use drugs are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And that is the end of the summary. There is, of course, much more detail as the report goes on. And as I flick through the list, the right to health and international drug control is number 7 on the list, part 2. The enjoyment of the right to health of all people who use drugs and are dependent on drugs is applicable and irrespective of the fact of their drug use. It is important that drug use and drug dependence are not conflated. Drug dependence is considered a chronic, relapsing disorder involving altered brain function that may require special treatment, ideally utilizing a biopsychosocial approach. By contrast, drug use is not a medical condition and does not necessarily imply dependence. Indeed, the majority of people who use drugs do not become dependent and do not require any treatment. The right to health seeks inter alia and to ensure access to quality health facilities, goods and services without discrimination, including on the grounds of physical or mental disability or health status. Article 2, Paragraph 2 and Article 3 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights also prohibit discrimination in achieving realization of all rights within the Covenant. As such, an individual's use of drugs cannot constitute grounds for curtailing her or his rights, irrespective of whether she or he has a recognized dependent syndrome or whether the applicable drug control regime allows for imprisonment or other sanctions. People who use drugs and people who are dependent on drugs possess the same freedoms and entitlements guaranteed by international legal instruments, and both groups experience violations of their rights under the current international drug control system and regime. 3 treaties form the core legal framework of the United Nations International Drug Control Regime. The Single Conventions on Narcotic Drugs 1961, as amended by the 1972 Protocol, which consolidated previous international agreements and brought plants such as marijuana, coca and opium poppy under international control. The Convention on Psychotropic Substances 1971, which did the same for synthetic substances and precursor chemicals used in manufacturing drugs. And C, the United Nations Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances 1988, which increased the scope and intensity of international policing of the drug trade and highlighted the connection between the drug trade and organized crime. These treaties currently bring hundreds of illicit substances under international control, criminalizing virtually every aspect of the unauthorized production and distribution of these substances, although production, distribution and possession for medical and or scientific purposes is permitted. The treaties have been ratified by over 181 states and have guided the development of drug policies throughout the world. A number of United Nations bodies enforce the 3 drug control treaties and are required to promote and protect human rights, as identified in Articles 1 and 55 of the Charter of the United Nations. When the goals and approaches of the international drug control regime and international human rights regime conflict, it is clear that human rights obligations should prevail. The General Assembly has consistently adopted resolutions declaring that international drug control must be carried out in conformity with the Charter and with full respect for human rights. The primary goal of the international drug control regime is the protection of the health and welfare of mankind through decreasing the illegal use and supply of controlled substances while ensuring access to controlled substances for medical and scientific purposes. Despite this, explicit consideration of human rights is absent in the treaties and has lacked priority among the implementing bodies. The International Narcotics Control Board oversees implementation of all three conventions. It monitors illicit drug production and trade, as well as access to controlled substances for scientific and medicinal purposes, and has the authority to investigate governments that do not comply with treaty requirements. The Commission on Narcotic Drugs classifies narcotic and psychotropic drugs under different levels of restriction and serves as the governing body for the United Nations International Drug Control Programme within United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. The office is mandated to contribute to the achievement of security and justice for all by making the world safer from drugs, crime and terrorism. Although the drug control bodies rarely have engaged in constructive human rights related discussions in the past, recently there has been a welcome shift towards incorporating human rights-based approaches into their work. UN Office of Drugs and Crime has examined ways in which drug control can be synchronized better with the protection of human rights, and the President of the International Narcotics Control Board recently met informally for the first time with civil society representatives. The Commission on Narcotic Drugs also adopted a resolution concerning the promotion of human rights in implementing the international drug control treaties and has considered the issue of HIV/AIDS and access to medicines in other resolutions. Nevertheless, it is clear that significantly more must be done to make human rights central to drug control.